If you think back to middle school biology, you can probably recall the Linnaean system of taxonomy. Here, organisms are categorized into various taxa, with each taxa being ascribed a rank. For example, the order Primates contains the family Hominidae, or the great apes, while being part of the class Mammalia. The highest rank in the system of classification is kingdom, followed by phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species. But what makes something a species? The biological species concept is conventionally defined as reproductive isolation. In other words, two individuals who are members of the same species can mate and produce fertile offspring, essentially allowing genetic information to flow between populations of organisms. Now, this system is far from perfect, and in many cases, two organisms which can produce fertile offspring are classed as separate species. Also, when dealing with organisms like bacteria, which reproduce exclusively asexually, this logic is non-applicable. Although it should be noted that it is usually applicable to unicellular eukaryotes. Even though they nominally reproduce asexually by cloning themselves, most are also capable of sexual reproduction. They do this by merging two cells and the nuclei together, followed by a round of meiosis to produce daughter cells with their own distinct genome. Another issue is the ring species. A classic example of this is the greenish warbler, which inhabits parts of eastern Asia. Populations in eastern Siberia can interbreed with those in China. Those in China can interbreed with those in the Himalayas. Those in the Himalayas can interbreed with those in Central Asia, and those in Central Asia can interbreed with those in Western Siberia. But, where their ranges overlap in Central Siberia, the Western and Eastern Siberian populations can't interbreed. This is because the ancestor of these populations lived in the foothills of the Himalayas and spread northwards around the Tibetan Plateau. All the while, gene flow kept adjacent populations closely related enough to one another that they could still interbreed. But by the time they had spread into Siberia, the two populations had diverged so much that they could no longer reproduce. If some kind of environmental perturbation was to wipe out the Central Asian, Chinese, and Himalayan populations, leaving only the Siberian populations, the greenish warbler would have essentially speciated, or split into two reproductively isolated species. Two other examples of ring species are the herring gulls and the Ansatina lungless salamanders. A ring species can be seen as the biologic equivalent of a dialect continuum in linguistics. The most prevalent example today is Arabic. Someone from Morocco can communicate with someone from Algeria. Someone from Egypt can communicate with someone from Libya, and someone from Iraq can communicate with someone from Kuwait. Each time, there are a few differences between the neighbors, but they can still understand each other. However, the differences build up, and when you go from Morocco to Kuwait, the two dialects are no longer mutually intelligible. If you were to travel back in time some 200 years, and were to go from Sicily to Gibraltar, you'd also encounter a dialect continuum. But the educational standardization of languages in France, Italy, and Spain has set up more rigid linguistic boundaries. Above the level of species, we have the levels of genus, family, order, etc., and the classification of organisms as such has led to a misunderstanding of how evolution works. Specifically, it has led to the notion that evolution involves organisms evolving into a separate kind of organism. A distinction you often hear is that of macroevolution versus microevolution. The definition of microevolution is evolution within a species, such as the color of peppered moths changing after smoke from the Industrial Revolution killed the lichens on the trees. Meanwhile, macroevolution is when two populations genetically diverge to the point they can no longer interbreed. But one argument put forward by creationists is that we've never seen an organism evolve into a fundamentally different kind of organism, and insist that said event would constitute macroevolution. For example, take a wolf and a jackal. It's easy to believe that these two could have shared a common ancestor. We would have recognized this ancestor as a canid, and both the species in question are still canids. Again, you can take a jaguar and a clouded leopard. Sure, they could have shared a common ancestor, but that ancestor was a felid, and they're both still felids. You don't see a wolf evolving into a jaguar or vice versa. So, jackals and wolves are one kind, they're both members of the dog family, while clouded leopards and jaguars are a separate kind. They're both members of the cat family. But what about these two creatures? The one on the left is a spotted genet. The one on the right is a ringtail. They have very similar proportions. They're both adept climbers, have similar diets comprised mostly of small birds and mammals, with some insects and fruits thrown in there. They're nocturnal, and they even have similar coloration on their face and tail. So, are these two the same kind of animals? Well, yeah, but they're not in the sense that the wolf and the jackal are the same kind, but in the sense that the wolf and the jaguar are the same kind. In other words, the ringtail is more closely related to a dog than it is to the genet, and the genet is more closely related to a cat than it is to the ringtail. Your gut instinct might be to assume that the similarities between the genet and ringtail are due to convergent evolution, but they're not. Even though cats and dogs are often thought of as opposites, they're in fact about as closely related to each other as we are to the New World monkeys. It may not be that obvious looking at the more derived members of the cat and dog families like wolves and jaguars, but if we look at the more conserved members like foxes and the house cats, there are some quite striking similarities, leading people to call foxes cat-like canids. To clarify, conserved members of a given clade are those that more closely resemble the common ancestor of said clade, while derived ones have changed more. This brings me to a principle of evolutionary biology known as Dollo's law of irreversibility, which states that once a trait is lost, it can't be regained, and that as you go forward in time, the more the members of a lineage will differ from their common ancestor. Conversely, this also means that if you reverse the clock and go backward in time, the more the different lineages of a given clade will resemble the common ancestor of that clade, and thus the more they'll have in common with each other. Since evolutionary changes don't accumulate at a constant rate, this also means that the more conserved two members of a clade are, the more they'll resemble each other, because the more features they'll have inherited from the common ancestor. To illustrate this, we can look at a phylogeny of the wolf, fox, cat, and jaguar. Phylogenies usually have time as one of the axes, but we can instead use the degree of derivation from the common ancestor of cats and dogs. Because cats and foxes represent the more conserved members of the felid and canid clades, they will also be the more conserved members of the parent clade of cats and dogs, and the more features they'll have inherited from the common ancestor of said clade. This is even more evident if we look at the gray tree fox, the most conserved canid, and the first to branch off from the rest, which even has partially retractable claws and can pronate its forelimb. So, the features of foxes that we think of as cat-like aren't actually characteristic of the felids. Instead, they are the original character states of the carnivorans, the parent clade of cats and dogs. That's why foxes, to us, look like a mix of cats and dogs. They share some of the derived features specific to canids with dogs, while sharing other features of cats which they inherited from the common ancestor of cats and dogs. If the situation was reversed, and we instead domesticated foxes and big cats, we probably would be calling cats dog-like felids. Going back to the genet and ringtail, the reason they look so similar to one another, despite being as closely related to each other as cats are to dogs, isn't because they evolved convergently. They have simply barely changed at all since the common ancestor of all of them lived. We've actually identified this ancestor in the fossil record, a creature known as Meiosis, from about 40 million years ago. On top of that, it lived when molecular clocks indicate that cats and dogs split off from one another. Furthermore, if you look at a genet, it appears to have traits of both cats and foxes. Take note of the facial markings. We can see this in the ringtail too, but to do so, you have to look at the cuter, more conserved canids and felids, like fennec foxes and sandcats. The parent clade, Carnivora, also includes many of the dominant mammalian predators such as bears, hyenas, mustelids, or the weasel family, mongooses, raccoons, civets, and seals. Again, we can see the same pattern emerging. When we look at the more derived members like wolves, raccoons, jaguars, and wolverines, they don't look that similar. But things get different when we include the more conserved members like gray foxes, ringtails, wildcats, and pine martens. Sure, we can see similarities between the conserved and derived canids, procyonids, felids, and mustelids, but if we look at the conserved members of each daughter clade, now they look quite similar. So similar that had they represented the morphological diversity of the order Carnivora, as was the case roughly 30 million years ago, you would consider them to be the same kind, just as you'd consider canids, felids, procyonids, and mustelids to be each their own kind now. So evolution never involves one organism evolving into a separate kind of organism. Rather, everything is a modified version of what came before it. The lion and house cat are modified versions of the common ancestor of all cats, while the fox and domestic dog are modified versions of the common ancestor of all dogs. But both Hesperocyon and Proilurus were modified versions of the first carnivoran Meiosis. So, expecting the member of one clade to evolve into a separate clade would be like expecting a language to evolve into a member of a different language family. For example, all the Romance languages evolved from Latin, and the Indo-Aryan languages evolved from Sanskrit. Both Sanskrit and Latin are derived from the Proto-Indo-European language, but a Latin language could never evolve into an Indo-Aryan one, or vice versa. This brings me to what is arguably the most fundamental problem with the Linnaean system of taxonomy. Extinct species also have to be assigned a specific genus, family, order, etc. Meiosis is placed in the family Meiostidae, which is also within the order Carnivora. Yet, the members of Meiostidae gave rise to the canids, felids, mustelids, procyonids, etc., which gives the impression that evolution involves organisms evolving into separate kinds of organisms. But, of all the levels of classification within the Linnaean system, the only one with a functional definition is species. The rest are arbitrarily assigned. So, if a new species was to emerge, we could just arbitrarily create a new genus or even family to place it in. This is why many evolutionary biologists have argued that we should replace taxonomy with cladistics. Instead of having a ranked hierarchy, cladistics involves a twin-nested hierarchy of speciation events giving rise to daughter clades within a parent clade, which accurately describes how evolution works. This brings me to another problem of the Linnaean system. Since Linnaeus began classifying organisms, we've identified many groupings between the ranks. For example, since the order Carnivora was described, we've identified two major branches, one being the caniforms or the dog branch, and the other being the feliforms or cat branch. So, we now call them separate suborders, but since then we've identified even more divisions in each. To see how bad this problem is, here's a phylogeny of the Actinopterygii, or the ray-finned fish. This is a class, and each of these tips is an order, just one step down in the Linnaean system. But each of these nodes is a clade, so we have to come up with terms like subclass, infraclass, magna order, superorder, etc., until we eventually run out of acronyms, and the original construct can no longer support the weight of knowledge we have today. Although, as a side note, I do think that we should have a biological genus concept. Just as two members of the same species should be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, two members of the same genus should be able to interbreed. Take, for example, lions and tigers, who are in the same genus Panthera, but separate species. Hence, they can mate and produce offspring, but the offspring are sterile, preventing any gene flow between the two. While we can figure out who can interbreed with who across space, we can't do so in time. This brings me to the concept of a chronospecies, which is how far back in time that prehistoric members of an extant lineage would be considered the same species as their living descendants. Drawing boundaries between chronospecies involves a lot of guesswork, because we can't go back in time to determine how far back members of a living species could interbreed with their ancestors. I think I should note that while the whole branching tree pattern works at larger timescales, it can fall apart once you zoom in. Take Homo naledi, an extinct human species described in 2017. This species possesses a mosaic anatomy of traits characteristic of the more derived human species and the more conserved Australopithecines. What's more puzzling still is that unlike cats and foxes, it possesses an anachronistic mixture of conserved and derived traits, where one trait on the lineage leading to humans switched from conserved to derived, followed by a second, but Homo naledi has the conserved version of the first trait, but the derived version of the second, seemingly violating Dollo's law of irreversibility. How did this happen? The most likely explanation is that continued interbreeding with Australopithecines reintroduced some of the original character states back into the lineage leading to naledi. This can also explain why producing a phylogeny using different genes can sometimes generate trees with different topologies. So, instead of always using the branching tree pattern, sometimes it may be better to use the glacial runoff model, where streams usually split off from one another, but sometimes merge back together. And this harkens back to what I said earlier, that just because two groups of organisms seem very different now, once they were so similar that they could interbreed with each other and gene flow could occur between them. Well, that's all I have to say on the topic for now, and if you have something to add or an alternative view, I look forward to reading your comments. Thanks.